Alright everybody, welcome back. We are on another cyclone update, and this time we're looking at the global tropics, and today I have focused this update as a main video update because of I usually do them at peak intensities or like something significant with tropical activity. So in the global tropics today we have a lot of different areas, and we'll first go by naming all the systems. So we have Tropical Cyclone Vince, which will be a main talk, Tropical Cyclone Talia, which will also be an interesting talk with intensity fluxes, and then Tropical Storm 92P, which I, at this point I would recognize as a depression. It's clearly run apart, but yeah, it's definitely on the weakening side. Tropical depression, well, it says subtropical depression. It can still be classified tropical depression, but again, it's running out just away from Fiji, and it is also on the weakening side, but it is actually looking more healthy than 92P. We invest 92W, which had high expectations for development and potentially a tropical storm impact in the Philippines, like the central region, but at the moment observations suggest that it's very lackluster, bare bones, and going to be on the weakening side unless it progresses and becomes and intensifies just in the last minute towards the Philippines. And then we have 94S, which is just actually so we had Cyclone Fader, which is a tropical storm, and then it made landfall in the east side of Madagascar, just south, I believe, of Antananarivo, which is the capital, and then it's now been redesignated as a new invest for some reason, although I would say that that's very unlikely for redevelopment. It's definitely already reached remnant low status, and it's soon to just completely break apart and become unclassified even. So Tropical Cyclone Vince, let's go with this first, and then we'll make the last two bits, discuss the rest. Alright, infrared imagery. So this is the Southwest Indian Ocean tends to have a little bit of a jagged and sudden imagery. Sometimes it just runs really quickly, pauses, time skips, but you can still try to make use of it and understand what's going on. So I have this as the current imagery. Alright, before we do that, I'm going to just look at the previous imagery. This is captured from yesterday, and this was what was previously initially thought as where it would likely peak, where essentially it was traveling, was translating westwards, and we could see that the fact that it was a tropical storm, it intensified to a category 1, but then as it progressed westwards, in some of them are shorts and some updates that I do, you could recognize that there's a weakening pattern with the shear. The deep layer shear values exceeded much greater in the area it reached, and in that point it was shrinking in size significantly, and the convection was significantly waning at that point. And so it was not expected to intensify much, but when it progressed outside that region, it suddenly had rapidly intensified because of that difference. It just went past and southwest of that boundary of that shear, and then it actually increased in its size and blew up new convection. And you can see this sort of like this N-shaped CB that really overgrown on the northern side, and really that typically is associated with the strong upper level divergence, which we'll be looking at potentially. And you can see the way that it actually reconvected outwards and pressed outwards, and you can see the shear line across here where the old convection is breaking away, and this is where it gave way to the eye, because this convection pushed out and around and pushed the circulation around, and then it actually opened up the eye because of that divergence pushing the convection away and around, and we increased that circulation strength in the northern side, allowing for this convection to be initiated and push all the way around like this. And we can see this little black band that's went around here as well. So this was really what was expected to be this peak, and likely to weaken at that point. But then the parameters have changed from what the models and the environmental diagnostics kind of suggested, and that's now where we are currently, where we were seeing in this loop that it's not only increased in size, but it's reconsolidated its convection entirely to the point where it now got a much larger, wider eye, and there's a much more defined circular CDO pattern. There is potential signs of an ideal replacement cycle with this sort of lower convection band streak that's going on here. Potentially signs that there might be a little weakening and a wobbling of the eye, and some warm convection, potentially low level breaking through into the eye as well. And we probably see a little bit of breakdown in convection. But at the moment, this is the best consolidation and the phase it's been in, and you can clearly see the way that it's actually, it looks much more defined as it was a cyclone shape. It's a little bit annular now, and on this side you can see this broadening, and you can see this decent sort of cyclonic curvature, and you can see this sort of this streak as well of these little kind of like striations, and you can tell there's good upper level, mid-level outflow, sorry, and a good surface level inflows as well. With the circulation, you can kind of see it within a little loop. You can see that circulation up here. If you observe this bit here, you can see the way it's really looking healthy in the system, and it's obviously going to be a vertically stacked system. It did get kind of pushed around, and that shear kind of did cause an imbalance in that mid-level circulation to cause a little bit of vertical unalignment. But now, obviously, away from that, in this favourable zone, which still is on the marginal side for sea surface temperatures, reaching the near now the edge of the lower boundaries of where the sun is still warming up the southwest Indian Ocean area, and only at the boundary of about the 27 to 26 degrees Celsius. So it's very impressive that it's still able to hold on and rapidly intensify, despite even being outside of 30 Celsius sea surface temperatures, which normally is considered rapid intensification when there is an absence of OHCs, which are the deep waters that fuel it. A storm to typically cause rapid intensification. So this is very impressive nonetheless. And again, water vapor imagery we're going to be looking at a little bit. You can see that the eye is now becoming a little bit more visible in water vapor imagery. Clearly there's the eye is essentially drying out, so we've got that good latent heat that's being released, and the eye is able to now in the lower levels dry out because that surface moisture that's being wrapped around, and the center of circulation is able to press out that moisture in the very center, and allowing the dryness, the absence in the very center of circulation to pull in, and that intrusion that's coming in from upwards and is also essentially building up due to that water vapor latent heat being released like that. It's causing that dryness to appear right here, and that is showing around minus 32. So clearly it's on the decrease in the sense that now it's intensifying and the eye is becoming more prominent. And pinhole eye systems, you can never really do a very detailed analysis on water vapor imagery, so it's not ever really a useful tool. But now with this sort of wide annular shape and this sort of widening of the eye, it really becomes a useful tool to identify intensifications and the eye patterns and the way it's developing. And then we'll just look at Dvorak, because we'll look at the other analysis as well. So we can clearly see the way that the system had the deep convective, almost snail-like shape here, and this is normally associated with the strengthening side of the cyclone. This is normally stronger side and peak intensity, but you can see initially that it had weakened, and we really had a bare bone type structure on the southwestern side. But then you can see that really rapid push, that surge that comes in here, this sort of CB surge that comes in and then allows for it to now begin. And now we have this outer bounding that's like the minus 75 region, I believe, and then that's pushed out, and now we have a new minus 80s surge that comes in, a smaller, normally more spiraled. These high convections normally more spiraled in the center, and it can be compressed, and you can see this sort of gradient boundary in the echotops. It decreases slowly, but you can see the best gradients on the north side, But right next to the eye, you get this decreasing gradient until you reach the eye. And so it's becoming much more defined, and this is definitely a point where it's likely at peak intensity, because that is what normally observed at that time. And so with this analysis at the current intensity, I did not mention this in the beginning, but there's probably already a graphic that's shown, but the analysis has it at 140 miles per hour, and we're going to observe the pressure right now. Right, observations I normally look at on this. So we're going to looking at the next observation. So we're going to look at this graphic to see that this is now coming to congruency with the models here, and we have a lot of different observations. The Southwest Indian Ocean is a little bit different basin, but you can see that in Dvorak the best analysis is coming through, and likely the most representative of what the Dvorak actually observed in that imagery. And clearly Dvorak, the observations of the different types of satellites that are coming in are actually representing that much more better than, for example, the microwave, which likely is a little bit outdated as well. So lots of different angles of observation, different satellites that perform better. We have these DEMS, the FIMP, this FME. These ones, PGTW, are really the ones that best perform a lot, and like really put a good congruency in the updates, usually in the Southwest Indian Ocean. SIMS and NSOF normally do as well. They're normally quite updated, but then they also have this little bit of a tendency bias to think. Normally when the system is in its growing stages, it develops a lot more, and then they only see it as a tropical storm because they have not seen some of the lower mesoscale, microscale observations, so they have a little bit of a bias sometimes in this part of the basin. But then these ones normally have that reduced bias, and you can tell by the observation the satellite fixes each update. It tends to have that better congruency and that better representation of what's actually going on in the observations at that given time. So it normally, again, we can see this good congruency, and these updates are a little bit old now, but you can see they are still showing a high intensity, and so this is obviously probably more likely to be more intense now than and so the fast sat fix is probably likely to increase after this in the next update. And then we can see a little bit of the other models. So AIDT is normally it's a bit of a biased model. It's an AI estimate, obviously, so it's going to have that bias, as we know. But then the AIDT, normally when you see something like 112 knots, 129 miles per hour, and you see that it's 11:30, and this is a 2-hour behind update, you can tell from that bias alone normally, because it's a very consistent observed bias that I've recognized through the different pattern recognition. You can see that the intensity is likely to be as 10 knot, that likely increase. So we could be looking at 122 knots, and there's obviously that uncertainty in the actual intensity itself. And so this AIDT is normally a good representative to know where the minimum boundaries are, where likely the middle range, the actual average range you should be looking at for the actual intensities. And that's why when I normally put in my miniature updates, which I'll be releasing after this video, it will have normally at the bottom of that, like the description, like the little observations, the biases, and the ranges. And normally I'll actually use some of these other ones to build that. And so yes, we have some of these outdated ones, and the SIMS SAT-C, which has been really the only good observation I've been observing throughout this entire life cycle of VINTs. The other ones have had a very inaccurate and kind of offset, and not really been updated in observations either. 754 UTC, but this SIMS SAT-C is the only one that's been recently somewhat accurate in the way it's actually in the intensity. It's had a bit of an over bias, and sometimes said it had an under bias. Now it's an under bias when the intensity of the actual systems increased. When it was in its weaker stages, it had a little bit of an over bias. So there's a little bit of a line where it pushes up, but now it's pushing below, and you can kind of find an average consensus sometimes, but it's hard to do that. Normally your own observations and the actual microwave observations can tell you more than just looking at the number statistics that this has provided with you. And the SAR, which is updated as well. But normally the SAR essentially allows you to see the favorability in the environment. You don't really use it as intensity guidance because it's very off-put with the different values, because you look at the salinity values, and salinity values when you have the upwelling or when you have the downwelling or when they have precipitation, it can really significantly affect the values in the way it puts the values at, because the sea surface, you're going to have that different downward mixings, and that's going to affect the salinity levels, and so the intensity, there's going to be a bias sometimes with the overshooting or undershooting. And right there, normally when you look at salinity, you're going to be seeing that if it is at a high, if it shows a high knot value, that's showing high favorability for the cyclone. If it's still in its mature stages, it's showing that it's got a future of high favorability to progress over. All right, now we have Vince. We have the observations here, and we were looking at pretty high Dvorak scores. Normally, when you look at these high intensities, you can just try and take an average consensus and understand that yes, the Dvorak is now aligning with what your observations are at. And normally at high intensities, you start looking at the raw Dvorak more closely, as it really normally comes in to better fruition with the actual intensities always. That is normally happening. And then we have the wind field radius, which is important to see. So we've got a little bit of the circular sort of annular pattern as well that observed, and it's definitely increased in its size southwest 140 nautical miles expansion, and we can see the tropical storm is fairly uniform in its quadrants as well. The southern quadrants, southern hemisphere, will be pushed out and strengthened and normally more intense. And we actually have a quite large southwest quadrant where normally that's where the peak intensity is, and northwest at the smallest side. And so it could be a little bit of a imbalance on a small scale, not the micro scale, of the way that potentially even the mesovortices, the way they revolve around, can affect the imbalance and potentially increase the wind field radii. So it could be one of those sorts of situations. And then we would have on the time series, we don't need to really click on it, but it's normally going to have a scene type observation on the Dvorak, and we're looking at an eye type scene type where now the eye is becoming extremely prominent, and it's going to have that PMW adjusted type thing where it's just been in that consolidation phase, but now it's in that clearing phase, and you're looking always at the eye and the way it's developing around that Dvorak like CDO. And sometimes when the eye doesn't become less prominent, you get like a CDO as the main scene type to observe. Right, I like using this graphic always. It's not so the MPERC really it's just the mimic satellite observations, but it's not the so it's not going to be the TPW mimic observations, which are kind of low resolution but give you an overall idea of the precipitation, the development of the structure, the system, which is normally just useful to see the overall structure and identification of the environment. But the MPERC is that mimic brightness, temperature type observations, and that really high resolution, and you can see that core developing in this, and you can see that it's likely that we're looking around 20, so looking about 15 to about 30 kilometers, so relatively small yet core, and then we have that tightened core in the center with a little so we actually do have a little bit of an increase in the western side, so clearly intensifying as well, and likely to show that intensification in the southwest quadrant. And this maintenance of this strong central core and a relatively small radius is what you'd want to see to associate with when some system's about to reach its peak intensity and continue to intensify as well in its future stages. And also it will also represent that in its current life cycle, that there's no sort of eyeball replacement cycle kind of happening yet as of late. Right, deep shear, when we're looking at a pretty good congruency at the moment, where the system's in the low shear environment, very evidenced by the observations, and it's going to be increasing, likely 20 knots, it's saying around here in this sort of isobar line, and we're going to see that much more hostile around it, and much more, when it dips further south. This observation is showing that it dips south, which we'll be looking at in a second. but clearly favourable environment as well currently. We're just going to look at mid-shear values. These mid-shear values can tend to lead to a little bit of a, like that lot of like misalignment in the wind field radii and a little microscale structure sometimes in these 10, so when you have these 10 knot, 5 knot values, some of these values it's quite hard to understand on mid-level, because sometimes the mid-level can be a little bit higher, sometimes it can be a little bit lower than actually is represented. And this is a little bit of old imagery. You can clearly see like this sort of core that it had developed with its overall circulation, but you can see there's a little core on the western side shows the strongest. It's old, it's not really up to date, but you can see there's a representation of that the western side is the strengthening side, and that's good to make that judgment on where you think the peak intensity could be, and the fact that it is reaching peak intensity. This is a graphic that lags quite often, but I just wanted to say about like the hook sort of in the absolute due south type movement that it will make eventually in its life cycle. It's forecasted currently to have that longevity and intensity and maintenance, which likely, I don't believe that it will maintain this sort of structure for that long. But for the fact that it does have an annular structure does mean it could persist even into the high shear for a temporary period of time, but then it will weaken, I think, a little bit quicker than this will show. Although that those values may not actually be the actual representations, because by the time it reaches there, depending on the different forward speeds, it could essentially reach a point where the shear values that occur will fluctuate, and the direction of the shear and the speed shear at that point will definitely fluctuate. It could be less hostile, which is a bit like the barrel type situation. But then the due south hook is interesting because that's normally you can have a sort of extratropical low that's like a very large type system that's very broadened, and that can normally be associated with like the Antarctic region. These sorts of systems are very massive, so they have this large frontal system that's normally stretched and extended all the way out as a tail, and that tail can normally bring a little bit of induce a little bit of a forcing on the system's circulation itself, and that can actually cause that hook in the direction, and that is what is kind of seen here, and that normally does happen. I don't know if this graphic will appear on the screen because this can be quite laggy, but the actual graphic here clearly does show that same tail end that I was discussing right here all the way into South Africa. And yeah, a lot of the systems in the southern hemisphere, particularly the extratropical lows in the Antarctica, have this less surface friction, so they have more intensity usually, so they can probably build these pretty quite high convective tops, extratropical lows, and probably develop quite large, broadened, very longevity type systems, and so they can have very large, healthy fronts that can really swipe across with less friction, breaking down that front, that convection, and so very likely can cause an induction in the tropical systems to get pulled south. The one last graphic I wanted to look at was this one that I newly found, and I just want to look at it more. So it says DMV based TC environmental metrics, shear, divergence and gradient balances. And this is interesting because we can clearly see the vertical shear map on the top one, and we can see the way it increases in the time, and then you can see that it actually decreases, and that's exactly what's being observed. Shear direction mainly stays the same, so you would have like a south, well, not a northeasterly, and maybe sometimes even a southeasterly sort of shear vector as well. And then we have this divergent, and this is the thing that I was really interested. There was this sharp dip here that goes into negative, so the divergence, upper level divergence, is really important in these tropical systems. But sometimes, again, the case of like Beryl, for example, you have a negative divergence, so that means that you're having now a convergence instead happening. And so when you have this very sharp dip, it potentially could mean that the system's now going under or around into a high pressure type circulation. high pressure type circulations in the mid levels now bring converging winds, and that now decreases the divergence, and now you're getting the negative value. That likely could be what's happening here. That can be quite helpful. Sometimes it can cause the reduction in shear and help improve the inflow outflow, and help the system develop so it improves its own inflow outflow balances, and that also it keeps at bay from that hostile shear environment. So we also then have a radial imbalance in the knot, so that's more with the wind directions, and the imbalance in the knot speeds as well, and that is generally increasing as well. One of the things with a radial imbalance that I wanted to actually I forgot to mention is that when you have this increase, is that now you have a greater radial imbalance, so you're having a fluctuation in the inflow outflow balance of the system itself, and in the fact that the wind speeds are now changing in that different radial metric. Now that means that you're having a strengthening system, in other words, and so you're seeing also that it was observed sometimes earlier as well, even in a little bit of high shear environments, but that was clearly shown. And sometimes when you have what is a little bit odd is that is obviously seeing that decreased divergence, and but you're still having this increased balance here. But that also could just mean that now you've got more surface level convergence. Now surface level convergence is now building up that rich moisture and the convection, and that allows strong CBs to develop, and allows for better energy efficiency for the system. And the last graphic is R and W, the radius, the maximum winds, and you're seeing quite a large decrease in that. So you could see this increase here that could be a little bit of an eyewall replacement cycle phase, but now you've got that decrease, and that really does suggest that normally when you have this RMW decrease, you're having that very tight concentration, like Milton, for example. You have that very tight ring of the strongest winds that you see in like mimic observations of microwave type observations. So you have that very strong winds at in the core, and the fact that it's tighter is now allowing for the spin much faster, and maintains that sort of strong wind sort of a certain period of time. So it increases over time slowly, if more, when that happens. Usually, right on track with what I'm looking at, and the system is still clearing out as I'm recording this video. But now we have Cyclone Talia. So the system had likely already peaked, but the fact that it's had a very slow forward speed does mean that it kind of faced the same sort of environment and the upwelling in that same region over a prolonged period of time. So it's actually kind of decreased itself in its intensity, and a lot of shear that's been imparted around this area of circulation, and so it's decreased in this period of time. Now will likely maintain like that because it's been near Western Australia for quite a long period of time. But then when it pushes outwards into the open Southwest Indian Ocean, you will likely see that intensification much later, when it's away from any of these conditions, and probably redevelops entirely. Could be much more smaller and tight circulation, because right now we're seeing a very broad circulation and very sporadic initiations of convection that are occurring around the center of the circulation. It does show that the system is still able to cause that strong initiation of convection, obviously representative of that strong sea surface temperature boundary where it is at, and the fact that it is also able to keep that CDO bank very well maintained, at least for the fact that it's in these hostile conditions, because once that circulation kind of gets broken apart and becomes exposed, then it's very difficult to get a reorganization in that time. So, but it's able to keep itself organized, so it doesn't have to face that sort of reorganization phase in the future, or in the moment itself. And so yeah, the system is very broad, and you have that wide sort of circulation. You can have that decreased pressure, so might have like a pressure distribution where you have a system with a very low pressure, or like a lower pressure than anticipated, and then the winds are still very like low. They're not very significant winds, so you're seeing minimal tropical cyclone force winds, but then the pressure is actually lower, so you have quite a odd imbalance in the pressure wind distribution, and that could occur with this type of system. And then all the other systems are really progressing through as well. One thing I just want to look at was subtropical depression 15. So that, yeah, the system is actually likely to be considered more subtropical in the way that the convection is kind of being blown around a circulation, and it's kind of around the boundary of that circulation. Yeah, so this probably is better suited for subtropical type. So a lot of these islands should really be aware for the high precipitation values, and they're not anomalous, the amount of precipitation that they might reach, even to very southern islands. And it has kind of well maintained itself, and I guess the South Pacific is that type of place that's renowned for that sort of warm type, very soon, like those sea surface temperatures. Regardless of what they are, they normally have this allow for straight deep convection high equatops to develop even like that. And so those systems can normally persist very far south, and they can maintain that high convection for quite far south. So that so the total precipitation number that occurs on the islands actually could be higher and more anomalous percentages. So it's quite hard to understand if actually what the observation of that decreased divergence is really related to the pressure tongues, and seeing that this is a high pressure influencing it, or if it's potentially a different factor entirely. If it's a different factor entirely, then that probably will have to get discussed in the little video update that I'll do after this, because we can kind of observe a bit of a pressure tongue, and you can see there's sort of warm sort of surface ridges that develop, and the upper level ridges that develop, and you've got the extratropical systems. And then when the system moves much further south, you see these much more blue anomalous valleys, which are large extratropical systems, and the upper level troughs that move across, obviously influenced by the jet stream. So this potentially could be a bit of a surface ridge type pattern, and if not, then it's something else that could be explained as well. Alright, so I think this is going to be the finish of this update. It's quite a long update actually, but I feel like I've gone up through everything I kind of wanted to go through, and I kind of built up all the notes. So I think I'll see you guys in the next update.